Well, what a wonderful day everyone's having. I've heard lovely things around the sessions this morning, and welcome or to, should I say, the first plenary at the Future of ELT conference, or 2022. Now, Dr. Jason Anderson, I don't think you need much introduction here, Jason, but for those that this is the first time you've seen Jason, I think he holds the world record for having the most BC Eltons awards, is probably what I think about you, Jason. But Jason's currently based at the University of Warwick, as per the slide. I mean, he has at least 8 books to his name. He's a series editor of Delta's Ideas in Action, and I could go on and on and on, but I won't, because we need this precious time to hand over to Jason himself. So localizing English language teacher expertise, what, why, and how, and just reading the chat and seeing the amount of countries represented here, lots of localization to talk about. So Jason, without further ado, thank you very, very much for giving this talk at the conference. It's a privilege to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Now, just to check, Alex, can you still hear me? I was fiddling about with my...
Perfectly well, yes.
Great, okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Alex, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Trinity College London and Regent's University London for sponsoring this fantastic Future of English Language Teaching Conference in its 7th year, I believe. And thank you also for making it free, because that makes it inclusive. One of the lovely things about these international conferences, I was just interacting in the chat, and I've got my chat over here, so if I'm looking in this direction, I'm just looking at your interesting comments all the time. One of the lovely things about these conferences, there's no need to travel. We reduce our carbon impact. We can watch at our leisure if we watch online, or we can watch again if we want to. And it brings people together from around the world, which has a great impact on the cross-fertilization of ideas. But there's also a key danger to it, and I want to address that danger today. The danger of us assuming that we're talking about the same thing when we talk about English language teaching, because we're not always. The danger of us assuming that one model of best practice or methodological approach from one context can or will apply in a very different one, because we can't make that assumption. But before I move forward, just a little bit more about you. I've looked in the chat at some of your context. You're telling us about your country, but also tell us about your level. Who do you teach? Are you a primary teacher, secondary teacher, tertiary teacher? Do you teach adults? Do you work in private? Do you work in a government context? Let's have some context. Thank you. I'm a secondary in Spain. Great. Eleanor from Piacenza. Eleanor, what level do you teach?
Sorry, Jason.
In college, Marco, thank you. Fatima, at tertiary level, fantastic. And all levels from common, brilliant. Now, what we can see, zooming through the chat there, if you can have a look, is how diverse our contexts are. Erica, look, kindergarten and tutoring secondary. How do you do all these levels? We teach in such diverse contexts, and yet we call it all English language teaching. And that is a fascinating thing, I think. This is a very good example of how diverse our field is, our community. So let me say a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in my talk today. There's 3 questions in my title: localizing English language teacher expertise, what, why, and how. The first question, the what question, I'll talk a little bit about what I mean when I talk about the localization of expertise, and this specifically will refer to appropriate outcomes as a key part of localization. I'll then do a quick reality check so that we're all clear about exactly how diverse our community is, particularly in conferences like this. We should never assume that others share our context, our interests, or our potential outcomes. And then finally, I'll talk about some emerging solutions that will help us to address the... Oops, Alex, you can't hear me. Shall I put my microphone on?
It's fine, Jason. It's just when you look at the other screen, we lose you a bit. When you're facing the camera. Thank you.
Great. I'll move a little closer and speak a little louder. Great. Okay. Yes, and then the third one, some emerging solutions to answer the question exactly how can we localize English language teaching expertise? How can we build sustainable bases of expertise that are specific to my context, to our context? And when I talk about context, I might be referring, for example, to primary teaching in India, to secondary school English language teaching in government schools in China, as well as the often used contexts of private school education, whether it be adult learners or whether it be learners of a specific type of English, such as business English. That's great. Cool. So there we go. Let's begin with the appropriate outcomes. Here you can see a slide of some of our colleagues from China. These colleagues work in Yunnan and Guizhou province, and they were here together at a conference and at a workshop, and they were discussing exactly what they meant by their appropriate outcomes of English language teaching. There is a lot of contexts around the world in which we teach and learn English, and each one we tend to have somewhat different outcomes for English language teaching. US and UK based sources have always traditionally been the sources that have defined appropriate outcomes. But I think we should begin to question this, because often they're prioritizing uses of language such as spoken language use that are much more useful in certain contexts, such as if you go to the US or the UK and you need to speak and interact. Task-based language teaching might be a useful approach. But if you're never intending to visit the UK, or your students aren't, and they need English for academic and work purposes in an office environment, written language use might be more useful. Just to give one example, localizing ELT expertise needs to be based on research on what meets locally identified appropriate outcomes most effectively, rather than outcomes which come from exogenous, from outside our community, assumptions about what we should value in our language use practices. To give one simple example, a lot of people aren't aware, but China has recently moved away from a task-based oriented outcome in its curriculum design towards what they call a core competencies approaches. It moves much away from the kind of the idea of the ESL community assumptions about what an appropriate outcome of language teaching is, and focuses much more on what Claire Cramps would call an EFL, English as a foreign language context, where learners are learning language similarly to other modern foreign languages, where outcomes might include things like developing awareness of culture, art, and other aspects of language teaching, higher order thinking skills that are alongside the kind of the basic transactional outcomes that are often implicit in a large amount of SLA research, second language acquisition. So when we talk about localizing expertise, I believe that we need to define these outcomes either on a national level, if that's appropriate, if we're all secondary teachers in the same national context, or a local level. And I think that the research practices that can help us to localize ELT expertise can also be integrated into professional development activities of teachers in a wider educational community. So I'm trying to look at the chat. I better stop looking because Alex has mentioned my voice seems to drop. So there we go. That's what I mean by localizing ELT expertise, that we need to develop outcomes that are appropriate to us, our learners, and their specific needs as well. So let's move on to the second part, the reality check. And I'd like to begin by showing you a very typical English lesson with a typical English teacher. In fact, he's not just an English teacher, he's a primary teacher. His name is Jean-Claude. He lives and works in a village in Rwanda. I worked with Jean-Claude a long time, and you can see that he's teaching a fairly typical English lesson with his learners. There is a school. His classrooms are just behind, to the right of this camera shot, but this is the afternoon, and the sun beating down on the hot tin roof means that often they prefer to go outside and sit under the mango and avocado trees for their lessons. It's a very good example of how diverse our teaching and learning context can be, because one of the challenges that these teachers face in the afternoon is the classrooms get too hot to teach inside, and therefore they take the students outside and they have no blackboard, no whiteboard. So how do they communicate what they want students to write? This is a particular issue because these learners are still at initial literacy stages of their English and their first language development. So it's a nice example of one particular context of a typical English language teacher around the world that we need to be aware of. Now, Jean-Claude's context is, like many of ours, very diverse from the context in which the dominant approaches currently used in English language teaching originated. And if you look at, for example, some of Howard's research, a leading authority in language teaching history, we find that communicative language teaching emerged as a dominant paradigm in the context of tertiary and adult education in target language countries, i.e. the UK, US, etc., where students tended to be from different first language backgrounds and therefore had to communicate in English. Pre-sessional courses for university, Dick Allwright was one of the first people to try out some of these new communicative methodologies in the mid-1970s, And what they found, of course, was that because these students had to interact in English, they did so. And there was a lot of spoken interaction involved in this, because this is very much what the students needed. The communicative paradigm kind of became the dominant paradigm for language teaching in the 1980s, the 1990s, and past that. But of course, at the same time, English language teaching was spreading quite quickly, first into tertiary and adult education around the world, then into secondary education in foreign language contexts, and then primary and pre-primary as well. And of course, as Libor Stepanek's ITEFL plenary informed us, if you were there, if you were able to view it, an increasing number of those of us who teach with English or in English are also teachers of other subjects. And they're expected to teach these subjects through EMI and closed teaching, for example, English medium instruction. And then, of course, in my country here in the UK, there's an increasing number of teachers teaching a majority of EAL students in their class. So if you came with me to watch a lesson of any subject in a primary school here in West London, you will see that the majority of students are in fact not English first language speakers. And therefore, those are also teachers of English in some sense. If I show you a quick graphic, and I do some very, very quick mathematics, not mathematics I would publish, but very much stuff that I would estimate. You can see here in 2014, there was about 85 million teachers worldwide of all subjects, about 30 million of whom were primary. That number is probably over 90 million now. And it's an interesting fact that if we remember that, for example, most or many primary teachers are actually teachers of English alongside other subjects, in other words, they're all pretty much English teachers to some extent, then we suddenly realize that of at least 30 million of us who at some point in our career either teach English, teach with English, teach in English, only a minority work in adult education, that original context of communicative language teaching. A minority work in target language countries such as the US and the UK, and only a small minority of us would self-identify as L1 speakers of English. And a large number of us don't just teach English, we teach many subjects. And as Libor Stepanek's book also showed us, we don't always identify as English language teachers. We are in that sense quite reluctant teachers of English. So if we are to work out what we mean by an inclusive future of ELT, as the name of this conference I'm sure would approve, we need to recognize that we are mainly L2 users of English. That the term non-native speaker is one that many of us aren't pleased with, and Duale proposed the idea of LX user to mean L2, L3, L4, etc., rather than the old dichotomy. So we're mainly L2 or LX users of English. Many of us share our learners' languages, culture, and schemata, as Chelsea's talk earlier in the conference pointed out about translanguaging in part of India. Most of us work in national curricular contexts where we can't control the curriculum. We can't control the exams, but we do have a year to learn about and learn with our learners, very different from the private school context is typical in, say, the UK. And the majority of us teach learners who aren't motivated to study English necessarily. For example, like me, when I learned foreign languages in school, I didn't choose to learn them. I was just learning them because they were on the curriculum. And those motivational factors affect so many of us in the world today. Indeed, the terribly sad news that our great and beloved leader in ELT research, Zoltan Dorniai, has passed away. Such sad news, a key figure in motivational research, and something that I think he would have reflected on a lot as well. Such sad news that. And of course, a very important point is that the majority of us today work in the global south, however we define that. If it includes sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, we've probably got the majority of teachers and learners in the world today. And many of us incorporate our Englishing as an activity into wider languaging repertoires. So if we look at the historical dissemination of best practice in ELT methodology, it typically started in kind of adult tertiary contexts in higher income countries. And after that, it gradually disseminated towards first secondary and then primary and pre-primary contexts, and simultaneously from high income contexts to mid-income and low income contexts around the world. Why is this a problem? Because contexts are different. And when you move from these contexts, then the differences often become bigger. So that those who are most disadvantaged are those who are teaching in contexts often most different from the dominant center of ELT methodology. People like Suresh Kanagaraja and Adrian Holiday and Robert Phillipson have pointed out some of these points for decades, but these truths are truer now than ever before. Thank you, Christine. R.I.P. Bedonia. We will never stop using his work. And a good example of this is how we often use the phrase younger learners to frame what are actually two very important and central language teaching contexts. In no other subject are secondary school learners termed younger learners. They're just learners. The same for primary and pre-primary. But because the ELT kind of disseminated from adult to younger learners in private school contexts, we still use these phrases, even though they imply a very different type of class, context, and history. So there we go. Let me show you an example now of one of the dangers of why this historical dissemination of best practice can be problematic. This was a response from one teacher that who was in a research project that I conducted about differences between the needs of L1 and L2 users of English on courses like the Cambridge CELT and the Trinity CERT TESOL. And we found that one of the things we found is that different teachers often had different degrees of success when trying to implement what they learned. And you can see that this teacher did not have much success. And indeed, some unpublished data that she also shared tells us this, and this is the first time I've shared this data. It tells us something very important, that at least for one person, this historical dissemination process can be a very, very dangerous thing. This is an experienced, capable practitioner who found that what she was being taught for teaching in some contexts didn't work in hers. And it's just one example. There's plenty of people who have talked positively about these courses. I do myself a lot. But it's a really important reminder as to why we can't assume that one methodology fits all. So, moving on towards the third question of my talk, how can we develop more context-sensitive models of good practice? And please let us avoid this idea of best practice. If you use the term best practice, you're essentially engaging in an act of hegemonical violence, I can't even say it, where you're actually saying that my approach, my beliefs are true for your context as well. And that is unacceptable in today's multiple environments, as we see. So my feeling is that in order to move towards such context-sensitive models, we need to ensure that our research, our inquiry is localized, is collaborative, is primarily practitioner-led, and that isn't to say that researchers can't lead in some ways, but that practitioners are at least always consulted, that it identifies and disseminates good practice currently happening within our context, rather than assuming that we should import good practice from exogenous context. And also, in order to ensure that the actual understandings and the inquiry becomes supported by a robust knowledge base, it needs to build from the more exploratory, qualitative, small-scale studies towards larger-scale ones, such as metasynthesis, experimental studies, random controlled trials, etc. So there we go. Those are some criteria that I believe we need if we're going to move towards more context-sensitive, localized models of good practice. Let's now look at some examples of potential solutions, potential ways in which criteria that we draw upon can help us to do that, or in which ways in which practices that we conduct can help us to do that. And here's a nice photo, an example of an expert Indian teacher I worked with recently on a project in Maharashtra state. And these are secondary school students, all enjoying a bit of group work activity there. So there are 5 elements to most of the approaches that I'll show, and all of these tend to come through either in one of them or in some of them. They're all very much present. Collaboration, inquiry, exploration, inquiry, reflection, and expertise. And let's have a look at some of what I'm going to call initially teacher-led ideas. Teacher-led ideas for how we can develop our own understanding of what is appropriate, acceptable practice in our context. The first example is what is called exploratory practice, originally developed by Dick Albright and continued today by Judith Franks at the University of Leeds. And exploratory practice emerged because Dick Albright was concerned with, when he was engaging teachers in action research projects, the amount of work, time, and effort that they were often devoting to the projects, which often wasn't actually necessarily helping them very much. Things like data analysis, data collection, was often quite time-consuming and challenging, when in fact, he felt it would have been more useful for them to work collaboratively with their learners on solving the problems. So exploratory practice involves a much stronger focus on teachers working with their learners collaboratively to understand situations and puzzles. It focuses more on what Judith Hanks calls why questions rather than how-to questions, because the assumption that we need to solve problems is something that exploratory practice seeks to question. And to give an example of that should be pertinent to many of you today, we could move from the how can I get students to speak more English during group work type question, which we often see. How can I get them speaking English is often a question that teachers ask. Why not ask the question, why are my students speaking mainly in L1 during group work? And by changing that question, you seek to understand the classroom and the learners rather than to solve a perceived problem. Because if you do it that way, you might see that what you perceived was a problem is in fact a natural feature of how we language, how we interact in rooms and classrooms with our peers. And then you can look at the extent to which that may or may not be useful for a specific outcome that you have envisaged for that lesson. And sometimes it may be, sometimes it may not. It's just a good example, I think, of a why question rather than a how-to question. Exploratory practice prioritizes 6 principles that Dick Albright and Judith Hanks also promotes. And the first one I think is really interesting, to put quality of life first, classroom quality of life. And Sarah Mercer's plenary talk a little bit later will talk about how we can incorporate well-being competencies into language teacher education as core life skills. And I think one of the important ways that this can happen is when we work with our learners in our classroom to solve shared problems. And there's lots of research, I think, of teachers and learners working together happening in a range of contexts around the world. So there we go. There's a nice, interesting example to start with, exploratory practice, the perfect example of exploration. And I can see that Alex has shared some of the links there from Judith Hanks' work. Brilliant. Let's have a look at another one. The first of 2 of what I would call teacher-friendly action research approaches, also specific to language teaching, that is exploratory practice. And it's called exploratory action research, developed by Richard Smith of the University of Warwick, and through several publications now with Paula Rebolledo as well. And exploratory action research kind of draws upon this key element of exploratory practice, in the sense that rather than beginning by conducting an action research cycle, we need to explore our context a little bit in order to understand them and to understand what we need to change in our practice, if anything. And this is one of the key points that they mentioned, that sometimes you might find the explanation itself is a key and useful part of understanding my context. Exploratory action research is a teacher-friendly approach because it focuses much more on the teacher's needs and less on the research, data collection, data analysis, and so on. It's also quite a collaborative approach because, as well as having the exploration and action phases, as Richard and Paula have in a recent publication, actually, with the British Council, mentioned, it's often followed by a sharing phase, a phase in which the practitioners get together and they share the findings of their exploratory action research projects. And this is a very obvious way that we can localize expertise because we discuss and talk about in much more similar contexts. In fact, they're not always the same context, but they're often much more similar. For example, in this Mela, which is Hindi for fair, in which Indian researchers are sharing the findings of their exploratory action research projects in tertiary and secondary and some primary contexts as well, through poster presentations and mingle activities, provides a really nice example of how different communities of practice within India can share and benefit from each other's research. So there we go. There's another nice example of a teacher-friendly type of action research. As well as exploratory action research, one that is not known so well in language teaching contexts is collaborative action research, developed by Margaret Reel at the Center for Collaborative Action Research at Pepperdine University in the USA. Reel argues that collaborative action research can help develop expertise through engaging practitioners in what she calls progressive problem solving, taking this idea from Barreto and Scardamalia's research and teacher expertise and its development. You can see in collaborative action research some really useful opportunities for sharing and interacting. And just as exploratory action research tends to draw upon mentors or principal friends to support researchers, and those can simply be people who have conducted a research project themselves in the past. Collaborative action research often includes 3 opportunities for sharing: sharing with critical friends, sharing with local participants, and sharing with other action researchers when we feel that we've been through several cycles of research and we feel that confidence that we can do this. And we've seen examples of this in exploratory action research. At IATEFL this year, there were several teachers sharing exploratory action research projects in ways that are very similar to what was happening in collaborative action research. And I think, yes, Alex has just posted in the chat there links to the action research tutorials, which is a really interesting website if you have time to look at it. So there we go, 2 nice ideas for teacher-friendly action research: collaborative action research and exploratory action research. And if we bring them together, as myself and a few colleagues did on a project in China recently, you can create an environment for collaborative exploratory action research. In this particular project, we got teachers not just at the end of the project to share their findings, but we got them to work together right at the start of the project to decide on what areas of their practice, of their classrooms they wanted to research. And we found, because we had a large group of teachers in this workshop, we found that many of them had shared challenges and problems. These are all university level teachers from Yunnan and Guizhou provinces, China, quite low income provinces by Chinese standards. And they all found some quite similar problems in their classrooms. A good example was many of them were concerned about how some of their students are not motivated. What are known in China as non-English majors, students who haven't chosen English as their major in university still have to study it. And these teachers found that the students that they were teaching had low levels of motivation comparative to the English majors. And therefore, several of them worked together in a group to develop some research questions together, sometimes slightly different for individuals, to look at appropriate data collection and data analysis methods, and then also to share their findings with each other at a later stage in the project. And so it's an interesting example of how you can even combine things like exploratory action research and collaborative action research to make the whole project collaborative as well. Let's look at one more idea of a teacher-led means for localizing ELT expertise, a teacher-led way in which we can understand more about our context, and that is lesson study. Now, many of you may know a little bit about lesson study. It originated in Japan as far back as the 19th century, according to some sources. And instead of focusing on a problem of practice, it centralizes the lesson as an object of focus. Teachers get together, usually in small groups, and historically in the same institution or the same town or city. And they would work on one learning outcome or one lesson at a time within a curriculum. They would try to make some improvements to it, and then one of the teachers in the group would teach the lesson while the others observe. And then after this, there is a post-lesson reflection and meeting again to refine the lesson and to work out ways to improve it. And then they could move on to a future lesson in the curriculum when they were happy with this one. So it's also a useful way to develop localized resources appropriate to our needs, and something which can be particularly effective in primary and secondary contexts where the curriculum is the same for several years in a row, and where we need the resources to share them to teach our learners. Just like the other previous research ideas, as well as being collaborative, it also involves an action research cycle of the type that goes back to Kurt Levine's work in the 1940s, beginning by planning, teaching, observing, reflecting, and refining. And as we move forward into more digital and online modes for interacting as teachers, we can imagine very easily ways in which we could conduct lesson study in groups, for example, internationally, if we felt it was appropriate and we could learn from it. But more importantly, even if we're in the same national context, we can get together without needing to travel, which reduces our carbon impact. And we can find problems and lessons that we need to develop and to improve together. And of course, we can conduct the lesson observation, obviously with permission of learners and all other stakeholders, by using remote cameras and viewing these lessons potentially asynchronous at a different time. The teacher lesson study is a really nice idea, I think, as to exactly another way, an alternative to your typical action research as to how teachers can develop understandings of what works in our classrooms, context-specific expertise, separately. Let's have a look at one idea now, moving away from kind of teacher-led ideas. I think I've shown 4. to what we might call a network-led idea. And there are several of these emerging at the moment, which also adopt a kind of a research-oriented approach that I think is interesting. Another one is learning walkthroughs as a larger scale alternative to this. But I'll focus on instructional rounds, because I particularly like how Elizabeth A. City talks about this. In instructional rounds, a network of educators is formed. They may work in the same institution, the same organization or district. And if you work in a larger institution with several schools, then you can create a network within those several schools. Together, you define a problem of practice, as they call it. And this is very similar to the puzzles that we talk about in exploratory action research, in exploratory practice, exploratory action research. Some examples, one from Elizabeth, would be, to what extent are students engaged in higher or lower order thinking skills in the lessons in our school? A useful problem of practice that would probably apply to all teaching and all lessons if it were an appropriate outcome for our context. Another example might be, are any learners being excluded or disadvantaged from lessons? And if so, how? Or to what extent are environmental awareness and sustainable practices being incorporated into our classrooms? Defining these problems of practice, it's a good idea to define fairly general ones that will be evident in a range of different classrooms of different subjects. But there's nothing also to stop us from focusing in on one subject, particularly if your institution is English language teaching focused. And you could, for example, ask a question like, how are teachers working with emergent language in our classrooms? Draw upon Richard Chin and Danny Norrington Davis's area of research. And then once we defined our problem of practice, we could create smaller groups, 3 or 4 perhaps, who each together visit 4 or 5 classes within the institution. And they only visit each class for a short period of time. This was something which I originally was a little bit uneasy with, because I always feel the need to respect the whole lesson as an event in itself. But the key point, of course, about about instructional rounds is that the focus is not on the lesson itself. It's on understanding the practices, the learning, the student engagement in general within the institution or district, depending on what our network is. And it's focused on collective improvement. Now, for many of you, this may sound a little bit like lesson supervision, lesson evaluation, one of those times where somebody comes and observes your lesson and tells you how you need to improve. But instructional rounds offers a really interesting alternative to this, I think, that rather than taking a learning stance that is informative, we want to tell the teacher how to do their teaching better. We engage in the inquiry ourselves, that we want to learn by observing all the lessons in our institution. The unit of improvement stops being the teacher as an individual, but the collective, and therefore the commitment is collective, and therefore the output is a collective commitment. And the primary focus of instructional rounds is the students, their engagement and the learning, rather than the individual teacher. So I think it's an interesting idea, and one that if you work as a school leader, a teacher educator, you may be interested in trying out. Thank you, Alex, for putting those copies in there, copying those links. Now let's move on to one researcher-led idea, which I should have time for as well before I move towards my conclusion. One which I've been involved in myself a lot, teacher expertise studies. My PhD was a teacher expertise study. Teacher expertise studies, I think, are very powerful ways in which we can build context-sensitive practices, understandings of expertise, because they are based on practices that are already happening in schools in our context. I've worked in over 20 countries worldwide, and I can absolutely guarantee that irrespective of the challenges, there are expert teachers in every context. 3 of the last 5 teachers of the Global Teaching Award have been working in the Global South, one in India, one in Kenya, one in Palestine. So it's really important to recognize that expertise is everywhere, and that to create expertise, we don't need to go searching in other contexts, we can find it here. The question as to what is an expert teacher is a really important one, and a complex one, and one that we need to develop an understanding of locally as well. We can create local understandings of expertise. But teacher expertise studies, once you've found these teachers, are really simple, really, in some senses. That you find the teachers, you study aspects of their cognition, their pedagogic practice, their teaching, their development or their professionalism, and you share the findings for teacher education, for curriculum development, policy development, and so on. And one of the key things about teacher expertise studies is because they're based on practices that are already happening, the recommendations based on the study itself will always be feasible because teachers can do them in our context. We've just seen them happening. They're culturally and socially appropriate, and they're sustainable because they already have been sustaining themselves. And these three criteria, feasibility, appropriateness, and sustainability, are key to any innovation in any type of teaching to ensure that it maintains itself after the support has gone. So teacher expertise studies, I think, are a really interesting way that we can develop our understanding of what expertise is in our context more directly. They're typically researcher-led, but they can be participatory. You can include the participant teachers in designing the project, in choosing what parts of their practice the researcher studies. So there we go. Hopefully I've shown some interesting ideas for ways in which we can build our own understandings of what is appropriate expertise in our context. And just to recap on the elements that I mentioned partway through the talk, I argued there are 5 requirements for research inquiry if our aim is to develop local expertise. But the research itself has to be localized, and by that I don't necessarily mean just here, just in our context, but we need to be specific about what context we're working in. And so even if you work in an international institution, if you're looking at what is appropriate practice in our institution, you shouldn't be assuming it will work necessarily in a different one. So it needs always to be localized to a specific context of practice. I think it always needs to be collaborative, participative, because if we do it without the participation of everybody involved in the system, as Michael Fulham's research has told us so many times, it rarely works, it rarely sticks. They need to be primarily practitioner-led, and the expertise we have in our teachers to research their own practice, the amount of energy we have in teachers who are engaged in collaborative inquiry to find out what is appropriate good practice is something we should never underestimate the power of. And it's something which identifies and disseminates good practice currently happening, for example, in the case of teacher expertise studies. And it's something which I would argue that also nonetheless needs to move from exploratory, qualitative scale studies to larger scale ones. And here's a model, a kind of an example way in which these elements might be brought together. We've got a community here of teachers, teacher educators, professional researchers, and individuals who move between different roles within this community. We've then got the research itself, which has collaborative inquiry at its center, particularly practitioner research projects, such as exploratory practice, exploratory action research, lesson study, and so on. All of these can contribute to a database of findings that themselves are necessarily an outcome, a part of the outcome of context-sensitive expertise that can inform, for example, how we develop curricula, what recommendations we provide for teacher education institutions, and so on. But those databases can also inform larger scale studies. We can conduct meta-reviews, meta-summaries of the findings of such projects and share those as well in order to build a more robust understanding of context-sensitive expertise. And of course, you can see expertise studies will also contribute to the idea of building our own sustainable network of expertise. Expert teacher prototypes that come from them can also contribute directly to the outcome of interest and also contribute to large-scale studies. For example, if you find that all the expert teachers are doing something that other teachers aren't doing, then you can conduct an experimental research to see if this has a statistically significant difference on classroom practice. So there we go, a range of ways in which different elements can come together to develop this context-specific understanding of expertise. And exogenous practices of interest can be involved there, but only if they are filtered through collaborative inquiry. The idea that something from a different context will work here is a very dangerous one. And it needs always to be filtered through the practice of collaborative inquiry, for example, through action research, for example, through larger scale studies, to ensure that we do understand whether that practice is appropriate for our context. So there we go. Hopefully some interesting ideas there for building context-sensitive expertise. Oh, there's a link there, by the way, as well to Education Scotland's Collaborative Action Research Project, which also talks about some of the elements I've shown here, as does Michael Fulham's research. So to summarize, I've talked about appropriate outcomes in ELT expertise in order to answer the question as to what we need to localize. I've talked about the reality check, the fact that current dominant methodologies, which originate in very different contexts to the context in which most of us work in today, as multilingual L2LX teachers of English. And I've argued that there are 5 requirements for context-sensitive research into good practice. We've also looked at some emerging solutions, such as teacher-led ideas, such as teacher-friendly action research, exploratory practice, and lesson study. And we've also looked at a couple of other ideas, one network-led, instructional rounds, and one expertise study as an example of a researcher-led way of contributing to this. And I've also suggested a framework of sorts that could contribute to building local understandings of teacher expertise. And this framework itself, of course, will link in very well with many teacher development frameworks, because many of the activities involved also involve helping teachers to develop their own practice. So there we go. I think I've come to a conclusion. I've definitely come to my last slide. And you probably, I'm not sure if you can see the references there. Alex, no need to try copying those into the chat. And we can put the slides up online afterwards. If any one of those papers is of particular interest, just drop me an email there or send me a message on Twitter and I'll get them back to you. Hopefully it's been useful and interesting, and maybe we've got 1 or 2 questions, Alex.
And thank you very, very much. And I think you've touched a lot of people here reading a lot of the notes. And yes, there's a little bit too much there to render into the chat, but again, we will make these slides available to everybody after the event. I will just try to see if it works, but I don't think it will. So let's turn to some questions. We have 3 or 4 minutes, so quite a few questions coming through, Jason. So the first one round, this is anonymous, but which way round would you suggest for a teacher that's working in a multi-class setup? And I think we know there are many teachers that actually teach across different subjects, potentially different languages, etc. So anything you would have to say for someone in that kind of context, Jason?
When you say multi-class, do we mean multi-grade teaching, do you think?
I understood this, it could even be multi-subject, but it could be, we don't know who asked this question, so I'm afraid I can't ask them directly, but if anyone would like to add in the chat box what you meant, do please do so.
Yeah, I mean, multi-grade context is, in my experience, probably one of the most challenging teaching contexts of all, because you're working with learners of different levels of often different developmental levels, but also different levels, for example, of proficiency in languages that you're using in the classroom. And particularly in primary classrooms, this also links to literacy levels as well. And these are very good examples of how and why we need to look at research into multi-grade contexts across different countries and national communities, but also teachers of multiple subjects. So if we're primary teachers, most of us, not always, there are some countries like China where a lot of primary teachers are subject specialists, but in many contexts around the world, primary teachers are expected to teach a range of subjects. And one of the key things that we need to remember here, particularly those of us who work in language teacher education, is that those primary teachers need solutions that work in all their lessons. And therefore, if you're promoting an approach to teaching languages that doesn't work in other classes, the likelihood of uptake from the teachers is going to be low. And the likelihood of understanding and commitment to that approach is going to be low. Whereas if we look at approaches that work effectively across primary primary lessons, primary subjects, for example, teaching maths, teaching languages, teaching initial reading literacy, and so on, then those approaches are going to be more useful. And expertise studies are a really good way of doing that. Find expert practitioners within that particular group of that particular context and notice what they're doing and try out those ideas.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jason. And there's a couple of questions and comments that have been made around those expert practitioners, really around the criteria. Jessica McKay's question in particular, how do we identify, what is the criteria we use to identify those expert practitioners?
It varies a lot. And there's a huge amount of research into teacher expertise and teacher effectiveness as well. And I've done some publications and I've got some in the pipeline as well. But basically, one of the key ways for identifying expert teachers within a given context is to find out within that context who the leaders are and which teachers they perceive to be teaching effectively. You can draw upon, for example, learner exam results, but they're problematic because one of the issues is you can't isolate the impact of an individual teacher, what is called the value added factor in teacher expertise and teacher effectiveness research. It's actually impossible to isolate that. Linda Darling-Hammond has shown this, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have shown this, that you can't isolate the impact of one teacher on learners, and therefore all performance-related pay is wrongly attributed. So in other words, attempting to isolate the value-added factor of an individual teacher is problematic, whereas attempting to understand what a community of teachers' values and the practitioners may perceive are meeting outcomes that we consider to be important, and those can go way beyond the impact of exam scores, to socialization of the children, to support of peers in our school, our college community, to extracurricular support. These are all things that expert teachers do. But one of the key approaches that's used is a multiple criteria approach, where first of all you draw upon nominations from people like school inspectors, head teachers, teacher educators who work in classrooms, and then you add to that other criteria such as experience, a degree of higher qualification, for example, the MBPTS in the USA, or you can add to that all kinds of other things as well, for example, teachers who have received awards, people who are valued among their peers, and so on. It's a long topic and it's a very important question, but one which David Berliner's research, for example, has looked at in great detail. And there's a paper by Palmer et al. From 2005 that looks at these criteria in great detail.
Okay, no, very clear answer. Well, Jason, loads of food for thought here, and you've clearly, as I say, struck a chord with a lot of people in the room. So a huge thank you to you for your plenary today. Really useful stuff, Jason. Thank you very, very much.